Karma is not punishment. Karma is not punishment. And if you've ever thought karma meant, do something bad and something bad will happen to you, then you've probably been given one of the simplest and most incomplete versions of the idea. Because karma isn't a cosmic police officer. There isn't some invisible scoreboard in the sky recording every mistake you've made. You hurt someone, and somewhere in the universe, a red number appears beside your name. You help someone, and suddenly the universe owes you something. That's a very comforting way to imagine reality. But it misses something much more interesting. Karma is about what your actions do to you, not just what happens to you. And once you understand that, you start seeing karma everywhere. In your relationships, in your habits, in your reactions, in the way you speak to people, and most importantly, in the kind of person you are becoming every time you act. Because every action doesn't just change the world around you. It changes the person performing the action. Think about something very ordinary. Imagine you get angry at someone. They say something that hurts you. You immediately react. You raise your voice. You insult them. Maybe you say something you know will hurt them. For a moment, you feel powerful. You feel like you defended yourself. You feel like you won. But then something interesting happens. The argument ends. The person leaves. And you're alone. But the anger doesn't necessarily leave with them. You replay the conversation. You imagine what you should have said. You become more suspicious. The next time that person speaks, you're already prepared for another attack. Your mind is now watching for threats. You have created a pattern. Not because some cosmic force decided to punish you, but because you practiced anger. You strengthened a particular way of responding. And the next time something similar happens, that response becomes easier. This is where karma becomes much more practical. Every time you act from anger, you make anger slightly more familiar. Every time you act from fear, fear becomes easier to follow. Every time you lie, lying becomes a little easier. Every time you manipulate someone to get what you want, manipulation becomes a little more available to you. And the opposite is also true. Every time you tell the truth when lying would be easier, you strengthen honesty. Every time you remain calm when you could have exploded, you strengthen self-control. Every time you act generously without needing recognition, you strengthen generosity. Every time you face something uncomfortable instead of running away, you strengthen courage. So perhaps karma isn't primarily about what the universe does to you. Perhaps it is about what your actions are doing to you. This is why two people can perform the exact same action and create completely different consequences within themselves. Imagine two people giving money to someone who needs it. From the outside, the action looks identical. Both gave, but one person gives because they genuinely want to help. The other gives because they desperately want to be seen as a good person. Same action, different inner state. One leaves feeling connected. The other keeps checking. Did they notice? Did anyone see me? Do they think I'm generous? The first action may come from compassion. The second may come from insecurity. So if you only look at behavior, you miss half the story. What matters is not only what you do, it is also what you are acting from. And this explains something you've probably experienced yourself. Have you ever done the right thing and somehow still felt terrible? You apologized. You helped someone. You went to the gym. You studied. You meditated. You started eating healthier. You tried to become more disciplined. From the outside, everything looks positive. But internally, you're still fighting yourself. You're doing the right thing because you're terrified of being the wrong kind of person. You're studying because you believe you're worthless if you fail. You're exercising because you hate your body. You're being nice because you're afraid people will leave. You're being productive because you can't tolerate feeling behind. The behavior looks healthy, but the consciousness behind it is still suffering. And that's the part most people miss. This is why simply changing your behavior doesn't always change your life. Because you can change the action without changing the state you're acting from. You can stop texting someone obsessively, but still spend the entire day thinking about them. You can stop checking social media, but still compare yourself to everyone. You can stop arguing, but internally keep fighting everyone. You can become disciplined, but use discipline as another way to punish yourself. You can become successful and still feel completely inadequate. The outside changed, but the person doing the living didn't. And eventually, the old pattern finds another way to express itself. Imagine a person who constantly feels like they are not enough. They enter a relationship. First, everything feels amazing. Finally, someone loves them. Finally, someone chooses them. Finally, they feel valuable. But because their sense of worth depends on the relationship, they become terrified of losing it. They need reassurance. Then more reassurance. They start checking messages. They overanalyze small changes in tone. They become jealous. They become controlling. Eventually, the relationship becomes exhausting. The other person pulls away, and the relationship ends. Then the person says, "See, I always get abandoned." But look deeper. The abandonment may be real, but something existed before it. A consciousness organized around fear, and that fear shaped the actions. The actions shaped the relationship, and the relationship reinforced the original belief. That's karma in a much more interesting sense. The state you repeatedly act from begins creating the world you repeatedly experience. Not magically, psychologically, behaviorally, relationally, and, in spiritual traditions, this is where karma becomes much deeper than simple reward and punishment. Consider fear. When you're afraid, you see the world differently. A neutral expression looks hostile. Silence looks like rejection. Uncertainty looks like danger. A delay feels like abandonment. A mistake feels catastrophic. The world hasn't necessarily changed. Your relationship with the world has changed. And because you experience the world through that state, you act accordingly. You become defensive. You avoid opportunities. You don't trust people. You hesitate. You seek reassurance. You control. And those actions produce consequences. Then those consequences become evidence for the original fear. It's true. People can't be trusted. I knew something would go wrong. I knew I would fail. The cycle continues. Now imagine approaching the same world from a completely different state. Not blind positivity. Not pretending everything is perfect. Just less fear. Someone doesn't reply. You don't immediately invent a story. You think, they haven't replied. That's it. Someone criticizes you. You don't immediately think, they hate me. You ask, is there something useful here? You make a mistake. Instead of, I'm a failure, you think, I made a mistake. That tiny difference changes your next action. And your next action changes what happens next. This is why changing consciousness can change behavior without forcing behavior. You don't need to constantly tell yourself, be confident. You can become less dependent on other people's approval. You don't need to repeat, don't be anxious. You can become more comfortable with uncertainty. You don't need to force yourself to be positive. You can stop treating every negative thought as an absolute truth. You don't need to manufacture peace. You can stop creating unnecessary conflict with everything you experience. The shift happens underneath. And then the behavior begins to change naturally. This is also why positive thinking alone can be misleading. Suppose you secretly believe, I'm not enough. And every morning you stand in front of the mirror and say, I'm amazing. I'm successful. I'm powerful. I'm confident. But underneath those words, you still believe the opposite. So now you're fighting yourself. One part says, I'm worthy. Another says, no, you're not. And the more you try to force the positive thought, the more obvious the negative belief becomes. The deeper transformation isn't always replacing a negative thought with a positive one. Sometimes it's questioning the entire structure. Why do I need to prove that I'm enough? Who decided I wasn't? What happens if I stop building my entire life around that question? That is a deeper change. And this brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood part of karma. People often ask, why do bad things happen to good people? And that's a serious question. Karma should not be used as a simplistic explanation for suffering. You should never look at someone going through tragedy and say, they must have done something to deserve it. That's not wisdom. That's cruelty disguised as spirituality. Life contains randomness, biology, circumstances, other people's actions, society, accidents, loss. Things happen that are completely outside an individual's control. So karma isn't a permission slip to blame people for everything that happens to them. The more useful question is, given what has happened, what am I creating from it now? That is where your power begins. Two people can experience the same painful event. One becomes permanently bitter. Another becomes more compassionate. One decides, nobody can be trusted. Another decides, I know what it feels like to be hurt, so I don't want to become someone who hurts others. Same event, different response, different internal consequence, different future. The past happened, but the next action is still yours. And that next action becomes part of the person you are becoming. This is why karma is less like a scoreboard and more like a path. Imagine walking through a forest. Every time you walk through the same area, you make the path clearer. The next time you return, it's easier to walk there. Eventually, it becomes the obvious route. Your mind works similarly. Every repeated reaction creates a path. Anger becomes a path. Avoidance becomes a path. Jealousy becomes a path. Honesty becomes a path. Patience becomes a path. Courage becomes a path. Attention becomes a path. And eventually, you don't feel like you're choosing. You simply follow the path you've practiced. That's why some people say, that's just how I am. Maybe, but perhaps it's simply the path you've walked the most. And paths can change. The first step isn't becoming a completely different person tomorrow. It's noticing the moment the old pattern begins. You're about to send that angry message. Stop. You're about to lie because the truth feels uncomfortable. Notice. You're about to compare yourself to someone. Notice. You're about to seek reassurance for the 5th time. Notice. You're about to avoid something because you're afraid. Notice. Not with judgment, with awareness. Because judgment often creates another layer of the same problem. You don't need to say, I'm terrible for being jealous. Instead, jealousy is here. You don't need to say, I'm a horrible person for being angry. Instead, anger is here. You don't need to pretend the feeling isn't there. You simply stop allowing the feeling to automatically decide the action. That gap is where change begins. And this is where practical karma becomes incredibly simple. Before you act, ask one question. What am I acting from? Not, is this action good or bad? Go one level deeper. What am I acting from? Fear? Need? Insecurity? Anger? Greed? Approval? Love? Clarity? Compassion? Courage? You don't have to get the answer perfectly. Just asking the question changes the relationship between you and the action. Because suddenly, you're not just reacting, you're observing. And when you can observe the state you're acting from, you have the possibility of choosing differently. Imagine someone criticizes your work. Your first impulse is to defend yourself. What do you mean? I worked hard on this. That's the automatic reaction. Now pause. What am I acting from? Maybe insecurity. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe fear of looking incompetent. Once you see that, you have options. You can still disagree. You can still defend your work. But now you're responding from something more conscious. You can ask, what specifically do you think I should improve? Suddenly criticism becomes information instead of a threat. Same person, same criticism, completely different response. And therefore, completely different consequence. This is why the deepest change isn't always do more good things. It's become aware of what is moving you. Because if you don't understand the state you're acting from, you can spend your entire life doing good things for unconscious reasons. You can help people because you need them to need you. You can work hard because you hate yourself when you're still. You can seek spirituality because you desperately want to escape yourself. You can become disciplined because you're terrified of being ordinary. You can chase success because you believe success will finally give you permission to feel worthy. And you can achieve everything while carrying the same inner condition that existed before you achieved anything. That's why the real transformation has to happen at the level of identity. Ask yourself, who am I when nobody is watching? Who am I when I don't need approval? Who am I when I don't need to prove anything? Who am I when I'm afraid? Who am I when I don't get what I want? Who am I when someone disagrees with me? Because that's where your actual patterns become visible. Not when everything is going your way. Anyone can be peaceful when life is perfect. The interesting question is, what happens inside you when life refuses to cooperate? That's where your unconscious karma becomes visible. And perhaps that's the real meaning behind the idea that consciousness creates experience. It doesn't mean you magically manifest everything that happens to you. It means your inner state influences what you notice, how you interpret it, what you do next, and therefore what kind of life you gradually build. Your consciousness becomes behavior. Behavior becomes habit. Habit becomes character. Character influences relationships. Relationships influence circumstances. Circumstances influence your beliefs. And those beliefs influence your next actions. The cycle continues until awareness enters. Awareness is the interruption. You notice the pattern. You don't immediately follow it. And for the first time, the old chain breaks. You feel anger. But you don't have to become angry. You feel fear. But you don't have to obey fear. You feel desire. But you don't have to chase it. You feel insecurity. But you don't have to build your identity around it. You experience pain. But you don't have to turn the pain into a philosophy about how terrible life is. The experience can be there without becoming your command. So maybe karma isn't the universe waiting to punish you. Maybe it's something much closer. Something happening every day. Every thought you repeatedly believe. Every emotion you repeatedly feed. Every reaction you repeatedly practice. Every identity you repeatedly reinforce. Every choice you make when nobody is watching. You're teaching yourself what to become. Not in one dramatic moment, but quietly, repeatedly, day after day. And that's why the smallest actions matter. The way you speak to someone. The way you respond when you're frustrated. The way you handle rejection. The way you treat yourself after failure. The way you behave when you have nothing to gain. These aren't just isolated moments. They're votes for the person you're becoming. So if you want to change your karma, don't obsess over becoming a perfect person. Don't spend your life trying to collect good deeds like points. Don't become terrified that every mistake will somehow come back to punish you. Instead, look at the state you're living from. Look at what repeatedly drives you. And when you catch yourself acting from fear, pause. When you catch yourself acting from insecurity, pause. When you catch yourself acting from the need to prove yourself, pause. Then ask, is this really who I want to act from? Because you may not be able to control everything that happens to you, but you can become increasingly conscious of what happens through you. And that changes everything. Karma, then, isn't a cosmic punishment system. It's a mirror, not necessarily a mirror showing you what you deserve, but a mirror showing you what you're practicing. If you repeatedly practice fear, fear becomes familiar. If you repeatedly practice resentment, resentment becomes familiar. If you repeatedly practice awareness, awareness becomes familiar. If you repeatedly practice compassion, compassion becomes familiar. If you repeatedly practice courage, courage becomes familiar. Eventually, what you practice begins to feel like who you are. And perhaps that's the real reason to become conscious. Not because you're trying to become spiritually perfect. not because you're afraid of punishment, but because every moment gives you a small opportunity to decide what kind of person you're rehearsing becoming. So the next time you find yourself asking, "What did I do to deserve this?" try asking something different. "What am I creating from this?" And the next time you find yourself trying desperately to change your circumstances, look one level deeper. Ask, "What am I acting from?" Because changing the action can change a moment. Changing the state you act from can change the direction of your life. And perhaps that is karma at its deepest. Not punishment, not reward, but the quiet process through which what you repeatedly act from eventually becomes what you repeatedly live from.